The ship's alarms blared as Captain Elias Carter struggled to regain control of the Starblade. The icy planet below loomed larger with every passing second, its frozen surface glinting ominously under the light of a distant sun. The engines had failed, the hull was breached, and the life support systems were flickering in and out. Elias cursed under his breath as he tightened his grip on the controls, but it was no use. The Starblade was going down. "Brace for impact," he shouted, though there was no one left to hear him. His crew had evacuated hours ago, abandoning him to his fate after a mutiny gone wrong. Elias had been left to die, but he wasn't ready to give up just yet. The ship crashed into the planet's surface with a deafening roar, skidding across the icy terrain before coming to a halt. Elias was thrown forward, his head slamming against the console. Darkness crept into the edges of his vision as he struggled to stay conscious. The last thing he saw before passing out was the flickering red light of the emergency beacon. When Elias awoke, the cold had already seeped into his bones. The ship's power was completely gone, and the temperature inside the cabin was dropping rapidly. He shivered as he pulled himself out of the pilot's seat, his breath visible in the frigid air. His survival suit was torn, and the thin material did little to protect him from the biting cold. He stumbled to the emergency supply locker, his fingers numb as he fumbled with the latch. Inside he found a thermal blanket, a flare gun, and a small ration pack. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. He wrapped the blanket around his shoulders and stepped out of the ship, his boots crunching on the icy ground. The planet was a frozen wasteland, with jagged ice formations stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky was a pale gray, and the air was so cold it burned his lungs with every breath. Elias activated the emergency beacon on his wrist communicator, but the signal was weak. He doubted anyone would find him in time. As he trudged through the snow, Elias's thoughts turned to the mutiny. He had trusted his crew, but they had turned on him when he refused to abandon a stranded colony ship they had encountered. Elias had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it wasn't easy. Now it seemed his principles had cost him everything. Hours passed, and the cold grew unbearable. Elias's fingers were stiff, and his movements were sluggish. He knew he couldn't last much longer out here. Just as he was about to give up hope, he saw something in the distance, a faint glow like a fire burning in the snow. Summoning the last of his strength, Elias stumbled toward the light. As he drew closer, he realized it wasn't a fire at all. It was a creature, a massive humanoid figure covered in thick fur-like scales that shimmered with an otherworldly glow. The being stood at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and powerful limbs. Its eyes glowed a deep molten gold, and its breath came out in warm, steamy puffs. Elias froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The creature turned its head, its golden eyes locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then the creature let out a low, rumbling growl and took a step toward him. Elias raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, his mind racing. He had no weapons, no way to defend himself. But to his surprise, the creature didn't attack. Instead, it tilted its head, studying him with what almost seemed like curiosity. I mean no harm," Elias stammered, his voice trembling. "I'm stranded. I need help." The creature let out another growl, but this time it sounded almost gentle. It stepped closer, and Elias could feel the heat radiating from its body. The warmth was intoxicating, and he found himself leaning toward it, desperate to escape the cold. The creature reached out a massive hand, its claws glinting in the dim light. Elias flinched, but the touch was surprisingly gentle. The creature's hand was warm, almost hot, and it sent a wave of heat through Elias's frozen body. "Thank you," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature let out a soft rumble, almost like a purr, and then it did something Elias never expected. It wrapped its arms around him, pulling him close to its chest. The heat was overwhelming, and Elias felt his body begin to thaw. His shivering subsided, and the numbness in his limbs started to fade. For the first time since the crash, Elias felt a glimmer of hope. This creature, this alien warrior, was his only chance of survival. The alien warrior, whom Elias came to call Kale, led him to a hidden cave deep within the ice. The walls were lined with glowing crystals that emitted a soft, warm light, and the air was surprisingly comfortable. Kale had built a small nest of furs and hides in one corner, and he gently laid Elias down on it before stepping back. Over the next few days, Kale cared for Elias, bringing him food and water and keeping him warm. The alien warrior was silent, communicating only through gestures and growls, but Elias quickly learned to understand him. Kale was a hunter, a solitary being who had lived on this frozen planet for as long as he could remember. He had never encountered another intelligent creature before, and he seemed fascinated by Elias. As Elias regained his strength, he began to explore the cave. He found strange carvings on the walls, depicting scenes of battles and hunts. Kale watched him intently, his golden eyes following every move. One day, Elias pointed to the carvings and then to Kale, raising an eyebrow in question. Kale let out a low growl and nodded, placing a hand on his chest. The carvings were his story, his history. Elias realized that Kale was not just a warrior, but a guardian. He had been left on this planet to protect something, though Elias couldn't yet figure out what. Weeks passed and Elias grew stronger. He and Kale developed a bond, a silent understanding that transcended language. Kale taught Elias how to survive on the ice planet, showing him how to hunt the strange, glowing creatures that lived beneath the surface. In return, Elias shared stories of his life among the stars, of the worlds he had seen and the people he had met. But as the days turned into months, Elias began to wonder if he would ever leave this planet. The emergency beacon on his wrist had long since died, and there was no sign of rescue. He was grateful to Kale for saving his life, but he couldn't shake the feeling of longing for home. One night, as they sat by the glowing crystals, Elias turned to Kale. "I need to find a way off this planet," he said, his voice firm. "I can't stay here forever." Kale's golden eyes narrowed, and he let out a low growl. For a moment, Elias thought he had angered him. But then Kale stood and motioned for Elias to follow. They traveled deep into the ice, far beyond the cave. The journey was treacherous, but Kale guided Elias with unwavering confidence. Finally, they reached a massive structure buried beneath the snow, a ship ancient and weathered but intact. Elias's heart raced as he realized what it was. "This is your ship," he said, turning to Kale. "You're not from this planet either." Kale nodded, his expression solemn. He placed a hand on the ship's hull, his claws scraping against the metal. Then he turned to Elias and let out a deep, resonant growl. It was a sound of farewell,